Okay, hello everybody. So I want to walk through this other story that we're kind of using as a template or practice for the literary analysis. So the second story is called The Lottery. It's by Shirley Jackson and was written about the same time period as There Will Come Soft Rain. So There Will Come Soft Rains, Ray Bradbury, 1950. This one, Shirley Jackson, 1948. And that will come into play a little bit later. So the first thing, of course, is if you haven't read the story yet, go ahead and pause the video. Once you've read it and thought about it, come back and watch the video. So an overview. So again, as we start to kind of ground ourselves in a literary analysis, it can be really helpful to just think about the basics. What happens in the story? Who's in the story, or who's the story about? Are there any obvious themes? How are the themes or symbols presented? Kind of clues, right? And then what are we unsure about? Again, remembering that confusion is key, and we're not trying to solve a riddle. We're trying to figure out what we think the story is about. So if I were to start with a summary, I might say a small unnamed rural town is gathering for an annual lottery. All of the townspeople draw from a box until one person is selected, and the winner of the lottery is stoned by the remaining villagers. Again, that's a 3-sentence summary of the whole story. I'm not worried about spoilers. All I want to do is convey the basic information, and I can expand on other things in my body paragraphs. But again, I want to give that the basic foundation of the story, and I could add in more detail if I wanted to, and a lot of the detail that I add into the introduction would depend on what my thesis is. If I want to focus on a particular character, I might introduce the character here as well. So I'm going to give myself a summary, and then I might think about the characters. Now, this is one of those things that's probably best for early sort of brainstorming, seeing what you have to work with. But I could go through the characters. I've got Old Man Warner, Mr. Summer, Mr. Graves. I've got the boys gathering rocks. I've got Tess Hutchinson, and I've got the Delacroix family. Now, if you went and you Googled the lottery and looked at a literary analysis of this on something like SparkNotes or Wikipedia or something like that, one of the things that a lot of people will talk about are the names here, right? Old Man Warner is the old guy that is warning them not to change things, right? Delacroix means of the cross, right? Mr. Summers, right? It was summertime when everything returns to life. Mr. Graves, of course. So there are hints in the characters too, but at least in the characters' names. But if we aren't going to be chasing down that idea that there's some symbolism in the names, we might go ahead and leave that out. But it is helpful to think about who are the main characters, especially if we're going to be talking about, say, the ultimate winner of the lottery. So some clues and observations that we might come to right away is, again, we could think back to as we were reading the story the first time, where did we start to get suspicious that things weren't as they seemed, right? Everybody's gathering for a lottery. Nobody seems really excited, right? Everything's really subdued. Everybody seems nervous. There's a strange detail about boys gathering rocks. Then we have this ceremony of the box and all of this effort put into explaining the box and, what it used to look like, and that there used to be some sort of chant going along with it. And then we get Old Man Warner talking about, again, people in other villages no longer doing this lottery, right? And saying they're a pack of fools and stuff like that, which should raise our sort of concerns on it. Something's not as it seems here. And then we get Tessie's reaction to winning, right? Let him choose again. Well, we would think if this was a prize, if this was like $5 million, nobody would be saying, oh, I won. No, we should give it another try. Maybe something went wrong. So that sort of doesn't match with our expectations. So now we could be saying like, okay, why would Shirley Jackson write a story called The Lottery, which is a lottery of sorts, but there's nothing good to win from it? What would her moral be? Like, what is she trying to get at? And again, I encourage you to pause, kind of struggle with this for a little bit, think about what it might be, because that's what's going to help us develop those critical thinking and close reading skills. So I think it's probably fair to say one of the themes here, what the moral is, the dangers of blindly following tradition, right? So we could say we shouldn't do things just because they've always been done, right? Or Shirley Jackson reminds us that if we're blindly following tradition only because it's tradition, we risk doing something that is not for the best, right? Evidence I could pull from that: most people in this don't know why they're following the tradition. They can't remember. Most of the original processes and traditions associated with this are lost. So again, when we think about this and contextualizing it and unpacking it, one way to do that, like we looked at with There Will Come Soft Rains, is to think about, as with Soft Rains, right, we talked about how it was published in 1950. This was not long after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the first use of nuclear weapons. And perhaps Ray Bradbury was saying, hey, we need to be careful about how we evolve technology because it can be very dangerous. Here, it's actually very similar. This one was published in 1948, so we're in that time period immediately post-World War II, and Jackson seems to be saying we need to be careful about traditions. And that actually leads us to a sort of layer deeper with this, which is kind of food for thought, but also a reminder that what we read, the meaning of it changes depending on who the audience is. And I'll get back to that in a second. But at the time this story was published in 1948 in the United States, in the New Yorker, which is a massive magazine, Shirley Jackson got a lot of hate mail, and people were canceling their subscriptions to the New Yorker. Why was that? I mean, people were really offended by this story. Now, it had to do, I think, with that idea that we were immediately post-World War II. It had to do with tradition, it had to do with trusting traditions and following them without questioning. Now, because the town is presented as a sort of rural Anytown, USA, and these are totally normal people, it seems to be that Shirley Jackson is questioning why we still follow certain traditions. Now, that could be any number of things. There's also a sort of biblical component to it, which might have offended some people. But when we think about that idea of audience, when we read this story in 2024, it's got a different meaning to it than in 1948. I don't think people read this story now and are patently offended by it. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like people just think it's kind of an odd, strange story. So again, when we think about any piece of writing, we think about who the writer is and we think about who the reader is, right? We want to, as writers, we want to be maintaining what I call audience awareness, right? Who are we writing for? That audience changes over time, right? Shirley Jackson would have had no way of knowing when she wrote this story that, hey, you know what? I think in 2024, long after I'm gone, people at a community college in Shoreline will be reading this and thinking about it. And here are all of the things that are going to be part of their experience. They're going to be familiar with something called the internet, right? And they're going to be familiar with high-speed communication, and they'll have just lived through a pandemic, right? There are a lot of things that change the way that we read and react to something that are important to how we interpret a moral or a meaning or lesson. So I'm just going to do it for this video. Again, I just want you to be thinking about how do we approach these things? How do we begin to think about the overall moral meaning message, and how can we find evidence to point that out? All right, so there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later.